Jerusalem had been taken in blood. The First Crusade was over, but the city was not at peace. Above the old sacred platform, near the place crusaders associated with Solomon's temple, a small brotherhood of knights was given shelter. Not an army, not yet a legend, just a handful of armed men, poor in name, dangerous in purpose, standing where biblical memory and conquest pressed against each other. And from that strange beginning came one of history's most persistent mysteries. Did the Templars inherit an ancient secret? Or did the secret come later, because the place itself demanded one? To approach that question, we have to slow down. The story of the Templars is often told as if it began in a vault, with hidden relics and forbidden knowledge waiting beneath the stones. But the first evidence points somewhere more human: fear, roads, pilgrims, politics, and the fragile machinery of a new crusader kingdom. Jerusalem after the conquest was not simply a holy city reclaimed by Latin Christendom. It was a wounded city, crowded with memory. Every wall seemed to carry more than one past. Every sacred site had been named, renamed, claimed, and reimagined. And somewhere within that unstable world, a few knights began to live in the shadow of Solomon. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Because the true origin of the Templars may not be less fascinating than the legend. It may be more revealing, not because it proves an ancient conspiracy, but because it shows how a place can turn practical men into symbols, and symbols into myths that refuse to die. Chapter 2. The Road Where Pilgrims Disappeared. The road to Jerusalem did not become safe just because Jerusalem had fallen. That is one of the easiest things to forget when looking back at the Crusader period from a distance. Maps make conquest look clean. A city changes hands. A kingdom is drawn in a new color, and the mind begins to imagine control. But in the years after the First Crusade, the Latin kingdom in the Holy Land was not a settled empire. It was a narrow, exposed experiment, stretched across hostile terrain, dependent on castles, alliances, fragile supply lines, and the constant arrival of people from far away who believed they were walking through the geography of salvation. Pilgrims came because Jerusalem had become accessible to them in a new way. To kneel at the Holy Sepulchre, to stand near the Mount of Olives, to move between the places associated with Christ's life and death. These were not casual acts of travel. For many, the journey was penitential. It could be the work of a lifetime, a vow made in sickness, grief, guilt, gratitude, or fear of the world to come. A pilgrimage was not tourism with better Latin. It was a spiritual risk taken with the body, and the body was vulnerable. Outside the walls, the sacred landscape quickly became practical and brutal. Roads passed through hills, dry valleys, scattered settlements, and stretches where help might be many miles away. A pilgrim moving between holy sites could carry very little, understand almost nothing of the local languages, and have no meaningful defense against armed raiders. Even a group of travelers could be slow, exhausted, poorly organized, and easy to watch from a ridgeline. The danger was not a single, constant storm of violence. It rose and fell with politics, seasons, local power, and opportunity. But that unpredictability made it worse. A road that had been quiet for one group could become fatal for the next. News moved unevenly. Rumor often arrived before certainty. Someone's cousin had vanished. A party had been stripped. A cleric had been found wounded. A caravan had not reached the gate by nightfall. This was the kind of fear that does not need exaggeration to become powerful. It lives in the gap between one fortified place and another. The Crusader states had soldiers, of course. They had kings, nobles, garrisons, and armed retainers, but their manpower was always limited. The First Crusade had taken Jerusalem in 1099, yet conquest did not solve the basic problem of holding territory with relatively few Latin settlers surrounded by larger and older regional powers. The kingdom needed defense at many levels: cities, castles, borders, roads, wells, ports, and shrines. No ruler could place a reliable escort beside every frightened traveler who wanted to touch the stones of devotion. This is where the early purpose of the Templars becomes less glamorous, and in many ways more interesting. Before the treasure stories, before the accusations, before the legends of tunnels beneath the Temple Mount, there was a plain and urgent problem. People were disappearing on roads they believed were holy. To protect pilgrims was not a decorative mission. It answered a real weakness in the Crusader project. The Latin presence in Jerusalem depended not only on knights winning battles, but on ordinary believers continuing to come. Pilgrimage gave the new kingdom spiritual meaning, political legitimacy, and a living connection to Europe. If the roads became symbols of terror, then Jerusalem itself became isolated, not just militarily, but imaginatively. A holy city that cannot be reached begins to lose part of its power. So the idea emerged of armed men dedicated to guarding pilgrims. That may sound simple now, but in the early 12th century it carried a strange tension. These were not merely hired swords. The emerging brotherhood presented itself as religious. Its members took vows. They were to live under discipline. They claimed a kind of sacred service that joined prayer to violence, obedience to combat, humility to armed force. It is difficult to overstate how unusual that combination was. Medieval society certainly knew warriors. It knew monks. It knew penance, pilgrimage, crusade, and the idea that violence might be justified under particular religious conditions. But a knight who lived as a monk, and a monk who fought as a knight, pressed against categories that many people still found uncomfortable. The sword had always been morally dangerous. It could defend the weak, but it could also feed pride, greed, cruelty, and the appetite for status. Monastic life, by contrast, was supposed to withdraw from the vanities of the world. The Templar idea refused to keep those worlds apart. This is one reason the order would later need powerful defenders. The concept did not simply explain itself. A man in armor could say he served God, but medieval Christians were not naive enough to think every armed man became holy by changing his vocabulary. The problem was discipline. Could violence be enclosed within obedience? Could warfare be treated not as personal glory, but as service? Could men trained to seek honor be reshaped into men who surrendered their will? The answer was never as clean as the ideal. No military institution is made of angels. But the early Templar vision rested on a serious attempt to solve a serious problem: how to use knights without letting knightly culture run wild. That makes the Pilgrim Road more than a backdrop. It was the testing ground of a new religious experiment. Imagine for a moment the emotional weight of such a road. A pilgrim might have spent months getting to the eastern Mediterranean, surviving ships, sickness, debt, and the ordinary humiliations of long travel. Jerusalem was close enough now to be imagined in detail. The traveler could almost see the promised places in the mind before seeing them with the eyes. And yet the final miles might be among the most dangerous. That nearness must have had its own cruelty. To come so far and vanish within reach of the sacred city would have felt, to survivors, like a wound in the order of the world. Not simply a crime, but a violation of expectation. The land was holy, yet the road could still kill you. The city was Christian-held, yet the countryside did not obey the neat logic of victory. The geography of faith and the geography of power did not match. The early Templars stood directly inside that mismatch. Their mission also reveals something often buried beneath the later mythology. The order did not need an ancient secret to become important. Its first importance came from answering a need that everyone could understand. A frightened pilgrim did not require a knight who possessed hidden wisdom from Solomon's vault. He required someone with a horse, a weapon, discipline, and the willingness to ride where the danger was. There is a humbling clarity in that. Later legends often pull the Templars downward, beneath the earth, into chambers, relics, coded knowledge, and sealed discoveries. But their earliest purpose points outward onto the roads. It places them under the sun, in dust, heat, and uncertainty, watching the ridges for movement, listening for rumors from travelers, measuring distance not in symbols but in how far a weary group could walk before night. The mystery, then, begins not with a secret chamber, but with a public failure. Pilgrims were vulnerable. The kingdom was weak. The holy landscape was not secure. And into that failure stepped men who tried to turn knighthood into a vow. That is what makes their beginning so revealing. The Templars were born in a world where salvation had to be escorted, where devotion needed armed guards, and where the path to sacred places exposed the raw nerves of conquest. Their first story is not a puzzle carved into stone. It is the story of a road, and of the fear that somewhere along it, a traveler might simply cease to arrive. Chapter 3. The Men Before the Myth. Before the Templars became an emblem, they were men with names that history only partly preserved. That is important. The legend invites us to picture them as chosen guardians from the beginning, already moving with the secret confidence of an order that knew more than kings. But the earliest shape of the Brotherhood was smaller, poorer, and more uncertain. It did not yet possess the scale that later made it feared. It did not yet command a network of estates across Europe. It did not yet have the protection of popes, the admiration of preachers, or the suspicion of monarchs. At the center stands Hugues de Payens. Even his presence in the story feels quieter than the mythology around him. He was not an emperor, not a famous conqueror, not a saint whose childhood was filled with signs and wonders. He appears instead as a knight from the world of lesser nobility, the kind of man who belonged to the military class, but not necessarily to the highest circles of power. He was close enough to lordship to understand command, loyalty, land, and reputation, far enough from royal grandeur that a new religious experiment could offer him a different kind of importance. That may be the most human way to approach him, not as a figure who arrived fully formed from legend, but as a man shaped by the pressures of his age. The early 12th century had opened a strange path for such men. In older patterns of Christian life, the warrior and the monk stood in separate moral landscapes. One handled weapons, disputes, honor, inheritance, and blood. The other stepped away from the world in search of discipline, prayer, and renunciation. The Crusades unsettled that arrangement. They suggested that a knight's violence, if directed toward a sacred cause and placed under religious meaning, might become more than a worldly profession. That idea was powerful. It was also dangerous. For minor nobles, crusading could become a road to salvation, status, adventure, penance, and perhaps land. Those motives were not always cleanly separated. A man might sincerely believe he was serving God, while also seeing a chance to escape the limits of his birth. He might seek forgiveness, but also reputation. He might be moved by devotion, but still trained from youth to measure himself by courage and command. Human beings rarely enter history with one motive written neatly across the chest. This matters because the Templars were not born outside medieval society. They were born from its contradictions. Hugues de Payens and the first circle of knights seem to have stepped into a problem that was both spiritual and practical. Pilgrims needed protection. The new Latin kingdom needed reliable armed service. The church needed ways to discipline the violence of men who already knew how to fight. And these knights needed a vocation that could make sense of their skills without pretending those skills were harmless. The result was not a secret society in the modern sense. It was something more peculiar to its time, a brotherhood that tried to give warfare a rule. We should be careful here, because the early record is thin. Later writers wanted beginnings to be clear. They wanted founders, vows, holy approval, symbolic numbers, and meaningful locations. They wanted the order's birth to feel inevitable. But the first years of the Templars are not preserved with the fullness that legend would prefer. Much of what is repeated about those years comes to us through later accounts, shaped by memory, institutional pride, and the natural desire to make origins look cleaner than they were. That thinness is not a flaw in the story. It is part of the story. When evidence is scarce, imagination enters almost politely at first. It fills a pause. It smooths a rough edge. It asks what the documents did not answer. Then, over time, it begins to decorate. A small group becomes a chosen inner circle. A practical residence becomes a clue. A lack of records becomes suspicious. Silence begins to look like concealment, even when it may only be the ordinary silence left by fragile institutions, lost documents, and unimportant men who had not yet become important. The earliest Templars lived before the world knew it needed to preserve them. That single fact removes much of the false glamour from their beginning, but it also makes them more interesting. They were not yet the famous order. They were becoming it without knowing what later centuries would demand from their image. They likely did not imagine that people would one day search their story for buried treasure, forbidden doctrine, royal bloodlines, or ancient temple secrets. They had more immediate concerns: food, horses, discipline, legitimacy, and survival. A horse alone was not a romantic detail. It was expensive. Armor required maintenance. Weapons required skill. Men required feeding. An armed brotherhood dedicated to escort and defense needed material support almost from the beginning, even if it called itself poor. The phrase "poor knights" can mislead modern ears. Poverty in a religious title did not mean the absence of all resources. It meant a chosen ideal, a public posture of renunciation, a claim that the individual knight did not live for private wealth. But an order made of poor individuals could still require donors, property, and organization if it hoped to function. Here is one of the quiet ironies at the root of the Templar story. The vow of poverty helped create trust, and trust helped attract wealth. That did not happen all at once. In the beginning, the Brotherhood was small enough that its survival was not guaranteed. It had no obvious reason to become one of the great institutions of medieval Europe. Many religious movements appeared, struggled, changed, or disappeared. Many armed ventures in the Crusader world left little behind but a name in a chronicle. The Templars became famous because later events made their origins matter. But at the start, their future was not written into the sky. This is where Hugues de Payens becomes a useful figure precisely because he is not too vivid. A more colorful founder might dominate the story. Hugues does not. He stands almost like a doorway. Through him we glimpse the type of men who made the order possible. Knights of modest standing, serious enough to bind themselves to a disciplined life, ambitious enough to attempt something new, and practical enough to understand that holiness in the Crusader kingdom often moved on horseback. They were not modern soldiers. They were not fantasy guardians. They were medieval warriors trying to live inside a religious idea that had not yet hardened into an institution. And the first circle around Hugues should be seen in that same light. Later tradition remembered a small band of companions, sometimes with symbolic neatness. But the exact texture of that group remains difficult to recover. We do not know enough about their conversations, their private doubts, their failures, or the small negotiations that must have shaped their daily life. Did they imagine themselves as temporary protectors, or as the seed of something permanent? Did they feel like innovators, or simply men responding to necessity? Did they understand how strange they looked to others? The evidence does not let us enter that room with confidence. What we can say is that their experiment depended on a powerful act of redefinition. They took the knight, a figure often associated with pride, violence, and worldly honor, and tried to place him under obedience. They took the road, a place of danger, and made it a field of service. They took the instability of the Holy Land and turned it into a religious calling. In doing so, they gave medieval Christendom a new image, the armed ascetic. That image would prove difficult to control. Once a knight could be imagined as a monk, and a monk could be imagined with a sword. The boundary between sanctity and violence had shifted. The Templars did not invent holy war by themselves, but they embodied one of its most concentrated forms. Their very existence seemed to argue that bloodshed, under the right discipline and purpose, could be drawn into the architecture of salvation. For some, that was inspiring. For others, it was troubling. For later centuries, it became irresistible. The myth grew because these men left enough behind to matter, but not enough to satisfy. We know the name of Hugues de Payens. We know the order that emerged. We know the holy geography that surrounded them. But between the man and the monument, between the first companions and the later machine, there is a dim passage where certainty thins. Legends love that kind of passage. They enter where the record lowers its voice. Chapter 4, Baldwin's Gift. The story turns on something that can sound almost ordinary. A king gave a group of knights a place to live. Not a revelation, not a relic drawn from the earth, not a secret oath spoken beneath the old stones. A room. Quarters. Shelter inside the royal palace area of Jerusalem, on the vast platform that Crusaders understood through the language of the Bible and victory. Yet this gift changed the entire imagination surrounding the order. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem was not handing the Brotherhood a neutral address. In the Crusader mind, the Temple Mount was one of the most charged places in the world. It was not only high ground within a contested city, it was a place where sacred history seemed to fold over itself. The memory of Solomon, the presence of later Jewish and Islamic sanctuaries, the Crusader claim to Christian lordship, and the raw fact of military occupation. To live there was to live inside a symbol. Baldwin's decision was practical before it was mystical. The young Brotherhood needed support. A king in a vulnerable kingdom needed useful armed men. The arrangement made sense. Give these knights a base, draw them closer to royal authority, and strengthen the fragile system that protected pilgrims and projected Latin power into the surrounding countryside. But history is rarely shaped only by what an action was meant to do. It is also shaped by where it happens, and this happened on the Temple Mount. That location became the seed from which later mystery would grow. Once the knights were associated with the site Crusaders called the Temple of Solomon, their identity could no longer be understood as merely military. They were not just guardians of roads. They were men stationed at the symbolic center of biblical kingship, sacred architecture, conquest, loss, and expectation. Even a practical housing decision began to look, in retrospect, like a clue. It is easy to see how later imaginations entered the space. If a small order of knights lived near the place associated with Solomon's temple, then surely they must have found something there. If they became powerful afterward, surely the cause must lie beneath their feet. If their earliest years are poorly documented, surely silence must mean concealment. The logic is seductive because it feels like pattern, a sacred site, a mysterious rise, a guarded order, and then wealth, privilege, and fear. Place those pieces in the right order, and the mind starts building tunnels. But the historian has to move more slowly. The gift of quarters does not prove a buried secret. It proves patronage. It proves that the Brotherhood had become useful enough, or promising enough, for the King of Jerusalem to support it. It proves that sacred geography could give a new institution instant symbolic weight. And it proves that the Crusader kingdom was willing to turn holy places into working spaces of power. That last point matters. To the modern imagination, the Temple Mount often appears as a place of pure reverence, separated from ordinary administration. But in the Crusader kingdom, sacred sites were also political assets. They were claimed, renamed, occupied, endowed, defended, and woven into the machinery of rule. A palace was not simply a residence. It was a statement. A church was not simply a place of prayer. It could be a banner planted in stone. A fortified position could carry theology in its walls. Baldwin's gift placed the knights within that world. For Hugues de Payens and his companions, the move must have altered how others saw them, and perhaps how they saw themselves. They had begun with a mission that could be described in plain terms: protect pilgrims. But now their daily life was attached to one of the most resonant names in Scripture. Solomon was not merely an ancient king. In medieval Christian imagination, he could represent wisdom, kingship, temple building, divine favor, and the grandeur of a sacred past that seemed to hover over Jerusalem like a lost blueprint. The knights did not need to claim descent from Solomon for his shadow to fall over them. The association did the work by proximity. This is one of the subtler forces in history. Names and places can become arguments without anyone formally making the case. A brotherhood housed near the supposed Temple of Solomon begins to sound older than it is. Its poverty begins to seem more meaningful. Its mission begins to feel less like emergency security and more like participation in a sacred drama that began long before the First Crusade. The order borrows depth from the ground beneath it. That borrowed depth would become invaluable. A new institution always needs legitimacy. It needs people to believe that it belongs in the world. The early Templars had a difficult identity to explain. Religious warriors, poor knights, obedient fighters, men of prayer and violence. But their residence near Solomon's temple offered a kind of symbolic shorthand. It suggested that their experiment was not merely new, but rooted. It gave them an ancient echo before they had an ancient history. Still, we should not confuse echo with evidence. There is no secure proof that the first Templars were established there because they possessed secret knowledge of the site. There is no need to imagine Baldwin as the guardian of some hidden Solomonic inheritance. The available outline of events points to something more grounded. A king, a vulnerable realm, a small band of knights, and a residence whose symbolism later became almost impossible to separate from the order's identity. In fact, the ordinary explanation may be the more revealing one. If the Templars had truly begun as heirs to an ancient hidden tradition, the story would belong mostly to conspiracy. But if they began as practical protectors placed in a sacred royal landscape, then their origin tells us something larger about the medieval world. It shows how institutions could be made from need, then clothed in memory. It shows how quickly geography could become theology. It shows how a military solution could acquire the aura of prophecy simply by sleeping in the right building. Baldwin's gift also reminds us that legends often grow from real decisions, not invented ones. The king did give them a place. The place did carry the name of Solomon in Crusader understanding. The order did become powerful. These facts are enough to create a mystery, even without adding hidden relics. The legend did not have to begin with a lie. It could begin with a true detail that later centuries refused to leave alone. That is why this moment matters. The Templars were not yet the vast machine they would become. Their rule had not yet been formalized at Troyes. Their papal privileges had not yet lifted them into unusual independence. Their estates, castles, and financial networks still lay ahead. But by receiving quarters on the Temple Mount, they entered a story much older than themselves, and from then on, every practical act could be read through a sacred lens. A horse tied in a courtyard, a knight returning from the road, a brother praying near walls heavy with inherited meaning. These were ordinary movements within an extraordinary setting. The men may have thought first of duty, discipline, and survival. Later observers thought of Solomon. The difference between those two ways of seeing is where the mystery begins. Because Baldwin's gift did not hand the Templars an ancient secret. It handed them something almost as powerful, a location that made people want to believe there was one. Chapter 5. The name that changed everything. Names can do work that armies cannot. They can make a new thing sound older than it is. They can gather separate ideas into a single image. They can persuade donors, unsettle enemies, comfort followers, and give uncertain men a reason to endure hardship that would otherwise seem merely miserable. The early Templars understood this, or at least they benefited from it. Their full name, the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, was not a simple label. It was almost a compressed theology. Every part of it carried weight. Every part solved a problem. Poor fellow soldiers, Christ, Temple, Solomon. Placed together, those words created an identity that was difficult to ignore. Poor gave the brotherhood humility. It suggested renunciation, restraint, a refusal to become just another band of armed men chasing land and reward. In a world where knights were often associated with pride, feuds, ransom, and the hunger for reputation, poverty softened the image of violence. It told the listener, "These men do not fight for themselves." Of course, that claim was always more complicated in practice. An armed order needed horses, weapons, armor, food, buildings, servants, land, and donors. Poverty could not mean institutional helplessness. A knight without equipment could not protect anyone for long. But the word still mattered, because it shifted the moral meaning of possession. The individual brother was not supposed to treat wealth as his own. The order could hold resources for a mission larger than personal comfort. That distinction would become one of the great tensions of Templar history. The vow that made them trusted also helped make them rich, and the wealth that made them effective later made them suspicious. But in the beginning, poor was a defense against the obvious accusation that these were simply warriors dressed in religious language. Fellow soldiers did something different. It created brotherhood. It did not present them as wandering heroes, each seeking private glory, but as men bound together under discipline. The word suggests shared hardship, shared command, shared identity. A knight alone could be reckless. A company under a rule could be shaped, corrected, and watched. That was essential. The Templar experiment depended on the idea that violence could be disciplined by obedience. The sword did not become holy merely because a cross was painted nearby. It had to be placed inside a life of order. The name therefore announced not only what the men did, but how they wished to be understood. Not as adventurers, not as mercenaries, but as brothers in arms under a religious purpose. Then came the most powerful claim of all. They were soldiers of Christ. To modern ears, the phrase can sound severe, even unsettling. To the medieval Christian imagination, it carried the force of devotion and danger at once. Christ was not a tribal banner to be used casually, though people certainly did use sacred language for worldly ends. To take that name into battle was to make a claim about obedience, sacrifice, judgment, and salvation. It raised the stakes of every action. It also raised the risk of hypocrisy. A man who fought for pay could be judged as a violent man. A man who fought in the name of Christ invited a deeper judgment. His discipline had to match his claim. His cruelty could not be excused as ordinary roughness. His pride became more dangerous because it wore holy clothing. This is why the Templar idea was never merely romantic. It was morally unstable from the beginning, powerful because it promised purification, troubling because it placed killing so close to prayer. The name did not hide that contradiction. It displayed it. And then the title moved from mission to geography, the Temple of Solomon. Here the order gained something that no ordinary military fraternity could easily create for itself, an ancient atmosphere. The temple was not just a building in memory. It was a place where kingship, wisdom, worship, destruction, longing, and divine presence had been imagined for centuries. Solomon's name carried the grandeur of biblical monarchy. It evoked a lost sacred architecture, a world where heaven and earth seemed to meet through stone, ritual, and royal authority. For a small group of knights in a new crusader kingdom, This association was extraordinary. It made their residence more than practical. It made their identity spatial. They were not merely protecting pilgrims somewhere in the east. They were attached, by name, to the place crusaders believed connected them to Solomon. A new order could now sound as if it had stepped out of an old prophecy, even if its real origins lay in the very immediate problems of unsafe roads and fragile rule. This is where the later myth found its doorway. The word Solomon did not prove ancient continuity. It did not prove that the knights inherited secret doctrine, discovered buried treasure, or uncovered forbidden knowledge beneath the platform. But it made those stories imaginable. It gave later writers a name around which speculation could gather. A title can become a magnet. Had the Brotherhood been known only as the Pilgrim Road Guard of Jerusalem, the legend would have had a harder time breathing. Useful, yes. Brave, perhaps, but not irresistible. The Temple of Solomon changed the scale of the imagination. It placed the order in conversation with scripture, ruin, conquest, and sacred kingship. It suggested depth. It suggested hiddenness. It suggested that beneath their plain duties there might be another layer. The name fused opposites so tightly that the order itself became a paradox you could remember in a single breath. Poverty and power, Christ and combat, monastic obedience and knightly aggression, a new institution and an ancient temple. This fusion was not just poetic, it was political. It helped make the Templars legible to donors in Europe who would never see the roads of Palestine. It allowed nobles, widows, bishops, and rulers to imagine that supporting these knights meant supporting a sacred drama at the center of the world. That is the quiet genius of the name. It turned logistics into devotion. A gift of land in France could become connected to the defense of Jerusalem. A horse purchased in Europe could be imagined as serving Christ near the Temple of Solomon. A coin placed into Templar hands could feel less like financing war and more like participating in the protection of holy memory. The name built a bridge between distant farms and the sacred city, between local wealth and cosmic purpose. It also made the order difficult to criticize. Not impossible, of course. Criticism would come, and suspicion would grow. But in the early decades, the language surrounding the Brotherhood wrapped it in meanings that were hard to attack directly. Who wanted to oppose poor soldiers of Christ guarding pilgrims near the Temple of Solomon? To question them too sharply could sound like questioning the defense of the holy places themselves. This is how institutions gain protection before they gain walls. They become symbols, and symbols can survive contradictions that would destroy ordinary explanations. A poor order could gather wealth because the wealth was said to serve poverty's mission. Warriors could live like monks because their warfare was framed as obedience. A new brotherhood could feel ancient because it carried Solomon in its name. The danger was that every one of these strengths contained a future accusation. Their poverty would later make their riches look suspicious. Their secrecy and discipline would make their internal life seem sinister. Their sacred name would make any failure feel like betrayal. Their association with Solomon would invite every theory that needed a hidden chamber. But at the beginning, the name gave them force. It did not merely describe the Templars. It created the mental world in which the Templars could be believed. And once people believed in that world, the small brotherhood near Jerusalem was no longer just a handful of knights. It had become a sentence that sounded like destiny. Chapter 6, Solomon's Shadow. Long before the Templars arrived, Jerusalem had already learned how to carry more history than any city can comfortably hold. For the Crusaders, the Temple Mount was not just a raised platform of stone. It was a point of contact with the Bible, a place where sacred memory seemed to have left an outline on the earth. To stand there was to stand inside a story older than Latin kings, older than the crusading armies, older than the fragile kingdom they were trying to defend. The name of Solomon gave that place a gravity no medieval imagination could easily resist. But Solomon's shadow was made of memory, not evidence. According to biblical tradition, Solomon built the great temple in Jerusalem as the house of the Lord, the center of worship, kingship, sacrifice, and divine presence. It was not simply a royal project. It was imagined as the place where heaven and earth touched through ritual, architecture, and covenant. A king famous for wisdom had raised a sacred house, and that house became one of the most powerful images in religious history. Then came destruction. The first temple did not remain untouched in some golden age outside time. It belonged to history, and history is not gentle with holy buildings. Jerusalem was conquered. The temple was destroyed. Later, another temple rose, and in time that too was lost to violence and empire. By the medieval period, the physical world of Solomon's temple was gone. What remained was scripture, tradition, longing, interpretation, and the stubborn human habit of attaching invisible meaning to visible places. That is the key to understanding the Templar connection. The Knights did not need to possess a surviving Solomonic inheritance for Solomon to matter to them. In fact, the evidence does not allow us to say they did. Their link to Solomon came through medieval sacred geography. The Crusader belief that their quarters stood in the area associated with the ancient temple. The connection was symbolic, devotional, and political before it was anything else. That may sound like a lesser mystery, but it is not. Symbols can move people as powerfully as documents, sometimes more powerfully. A document can be questioned, copied badly, lost, or exposed as false. A symbol lives differently. It gathers force through repetition. It becomes part of the mental furniture of a culture. By the time someone asks whether it is literally true in every detail, it has already shaped the way people behave. The Temple Mount had that kind of force. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the site carried layers of sacred meaning, though understood through different traditions and claims. The Crusaders entered that landscape as conquerors, but also as interpreters. They did not merely occupy Jerusalem, they renamed and rearranged it according to their own spiritual map. Places were read through scripture. Buildings were assigned meanings. The city became, in their eyes, a theater where biblical time had somehow returned. This is where modern readers must be cautious. Medieval people did not always separate history, theology, and geography the way a modern archive tries to separate them. A place associated with Solomon was not simply historical in the narrow sense. It was charged with expectation. It belonged to prophecy, typology, kingship, and sacred memory. To live near it was not like renting a room near an archaeological site. It was to be placed beside a wound in time, and the Templars were placed there. That placement gave their story a depth it had not earned by age. The order was young, but its address made it seem ancient. Its mission was practical, but its surroundings made it appear cosmic. A brotherhood formed to protect pilgrims could now be imagined in relation to the greatest temple of the biblical past. No storyteller needed to work very hard. The association was already waiting. Solomon himself was also the perfect figure to haunt them. He was a king, but not merely a warrior king. He was linked to wisdom, wealth, judgment, construction, and the ordering of sacred space. Later traditions around Solomon grew even wider, connecting him in the imagination with hidden knowledge, command over mysteries, and the building of marvels. Some of those traditions were far removed from the biblical core, but they helped make his name unusually fertile ground for legend. So when the Templars became powerful, Solomon's name offered an explanation that felt almost too elegant. Why did these poor knights rise so quickly? Perhaps they found something. Why were they associated with the temple? Perhaps they were searching beneath it. Why did they later become wealthy and independent? Perhaps their strength came from an ancient source. The problem is that elegance is not proof. The real historical chain is more modest. The order was housed near a place the Crusaders associated with the Temple of Solomon. From that association came their name. From the name came symbolic authority. From symbolic authority came support, admiration, donations, and eventually myth. None of this requires a secret tunnel. It requires only a medieval world in which sacred geography could turn a practical institution into a living emblem. That does not make the story dull. It makes it more precise. The temptation with the Templars is always to treat the absence of evidence as evidence of concealment. If we do not know what they did in their earliest years, perhaps they were digging. If we do not have records of discoveries, perhaps the records were destroyed. If no relic can be shown, perhaps it was hidden too well. This kind of reasoning is emotionally satisfying because it protects the mystery from every objection. But it also removes the story from history and places it beyond correction. A more careful approach allows the mystery to remain, but changes its nature. The mystery is not whether we can prove a direct line from Solomon's priests to medieval knights. We cannot. The mystery is why that idea became so attractive and why it still survives. The answer lies in the strange overlap between place and imagination. The Templars stood at a crossroads of meanings. Christian victory, biblical memory, Islamic architecture, Jewish sacred history, royal patronage, and the urgent military needs of a crusader state. Almost any institution placed there would have absorbed some of that charge, but the Templars were especially suited to it. They were already contradictory. Monks with swords, poor men who needed resources, servants of Christ who trained for war, guardians of pilgrims living near the imagined ruins of a king's temple. Their identity seemed to invite a hidden layer. It looked incomplete without one. The world saw the white mantle and the red cross, the vows and the weapons, the sacred address and the growing power, and began to assume there must be a deeper explanation. Sometimes mystery is born when a visible explanation feels too ordinary for the scale of what follows. Yet the ordinary explanation here is not small. A sacred place can transform reputation. A royal grant can alter destiny. A name can carry an institution farther than any single battle. The Templars did not need to descend from Solomon to be shaped by him. Medieval Jerusalem had already turned Solomon into a presence, and the order happened to build its identity within reach of that presence. That is what Solomon's temple gave them, not a proven ancient inheritance, but a vast symbolic inheritance. It gave them an origin that sounded older than memory. It gave their mission a stage on which every act could be read as part of a sacred pattern. It gave later centuries the material they needed to imagine treasure, knowledge, and hidden continuity. And because the actual evidence remains thinner than the legends, the shadow stayed flexible. It could stretch to fit whatever each age wanted the Templars to have been. The stones did not have to speak. The name was enough. Chapter 7. The Impossible Brotherhood. A monk was supposed to withdraw from the world. A knight was trained to enter it violently. Place those two lives beside each other, and the contradiction becomes obvious. One man lowers his eyes, obeys the bell, eats by rule, owns nothing, and tries to kill the restless ambitions of the self. The other learns to ride hard, strike first, defend honor, hold territory, and survive in a culture where reputation could be as valuable as land. The Templars asked medieval Christendom to believe that these two men could become one. That was the strange brilliance of the order, and also the source of its unease. The Templars did not merely give religious language to warriors. That would have been easier and much less radical. Knights had long prayed before battle, endowed churches, feared damnation, and hoped that violence in a righteous cause might be forgiven. But the Templar idea went further. It tried to place the warrior's life inside the structure of monastic obedience. The sword would not be abandoned. It would be disciplined. This was a difficult claim to make in a Christian world that had inherited deep suspicion toward bloodshed. Even when violence was considered necessary, it was morally dangerous. A battlefield could not be made innocent simply by blessing the banner. Killing left stains on the soul, and medieval people knew this. They might not have spoken about it in modern terms, but they understood that force could deform the person who used it. Pride, rage, cruelty, greed, and vanity could all hide beneath the armor of noble purpose. So when men took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, then kept their weapons, the result was not automatically comforting. It was unsettling. Poverty meant they renounced private ownership, yet the order needed material strength to function. Chastity meant they gave up dynastic marriage, one of the central duties of noble life. Obedience meant they surrendered personal will, though knighthood often trained men to seek distinction and command. Each vow cut across the normal expectations of the warrior class. The Templar was not simply a brave man with a religious cause. He was meant to become a weapon held by an institution. That image is powerful, but it is not gentle. A weapon held by obedience can protect the vulnerable. It can also become frighteningly efficient. This is one reason the Templars fascinated their age. They offered the hope that knightly violence could be purified through discipline, but they also suggested a new kind of concentrated power. Men who had fewer family ties, fewer private claims, fewer ordinary exits, and a shared identity stronger than local allegiance. In other words, the vows made them holy in theory and formidable in practice. For medieval supporters, this was exactly the point. The old problem was not that Christendom lacked armed men. It had plenty. The problem was that armed men often served themselves first. They pursued feuds, prizes, status, inheritance, and the emotional intoxication of glory. The Templars promised something different. Fighters who would not scatter after a campaign, would not marry into rival families, would not divide property among heirs, and would not treat war as a personal stage. Their lives were supposed to be narrowed until only the mission remained. Of course, ideals are not the same as realities. Any order made of human beings has friction inside it. There would have been ambition, irritation, fear, fatigue, pride, and the ordinary failures of discipline. A vow does not erase temperament. It only creates a rule by which temperament can be judged. The importance of the Templars lies not in imagining them as perfect holy warriors, but in seeing how intensely medieval society wanted such a figure to exist. The holy warrior answered a cultural need. The Crusades had opened a wound in Christian thought. If Jerusalem was to be defended, if pilgrims were to be protected, if Latin rule in the Holy Land was to survive, then violence could not remain merely regrettable. It needed a spiritual framework. The Templars became one answer to that need. They made warfare look less like a temporary emergency and more like a permanent vocation. That permanence was new. A crusader might take the cross, travel east, fight, pray, suffer, and return home. The Templar did not simply pass through holy war. He lived inside it. His identity was not seasonal. His vow bound him to an ongoing struggle, one that could continue whether or not a famous army had gathered, whether or not a king was present, whether or not Europe was paying attention. This gave the order a sober intensity. It also made it harder to categorize. Were they monks? Not exactly, because they fought. Were they knights? Not in the ordinary sense, because they renounced the private ambitions that gave knighthood much of its social meaning. Were they servants of kings? Sometimes in effect, but their highest obedience would eventually be tied to the papacy and the order itself. Were they poor? Individually, yes, in principle. Institutionally, not for long. The Templar was a contradiction wearing a rule. And contradictions are memorable. People often misunderstand this by treating the Templars' strangeness as if it must point to hidden doctrine. But the strangeness was already visible. It did not need to be buried beneath the Temple Mount. It was there in the public idea of the order. Men who prayed like monks and fought like knights. Men who renounced the world while becoming deeply useful to worldly power. The mystery was not only beneath them, it was built into their daily life. Imagine the effect of seeing them as a medieval observer, the habit and the harness, the vow and the horse, the language of humility beside the discipline of war. It would have been impressive, perhaps reassuring, perhaps disturbing. A violent man who claims holiness can be dangerous, but a violent man who submits to a rule might seem like violence finally brought under control. That was the promise. The fear was that the same discipline could make the order answerable to no one close enough to restrain it. A local knight had family, neighbors, rivals, debts, and visible obligations. A Templar belonged to a wider body. His loyalty stretched beyond local society. His possessions were not his, but the order's. His obedience was not casual. Over time, that made the Brotherhood both trusted and alien. This alien quality would later feed suspicion. But in the beginning, it fed admiration. The Templars offered medieval Christendom a way to imagine sanctified force without surrendering the moral seriousness of religion. They were not supposed to enjoy violence. They were not supposed to fight for vanity. They were not supposed to accumulate private wealth or build family dynasties. They were supposed to become disciplined guardians in a dangerous world. Whether they always lived up to that ideal is another matter. But the ideal itself changed the terms of the conversation. It suggested that the knight did not have to choose between the battlefield and the cloister. Under the right rule, with the right mission, in the right sacred geography, he could become both penitent and protector. He could turn the skills of a violent class toward a religious end. This is why the Templars became powerful before they became wealthy. Their first power was imaginative. They gave people a figure they could believe in. The monk who did not flee danger, the knight who did not belong to himself. Yet that figure carried a shadow. If holiness and violence could be joined, who would decide when the joining had failed? If poverty could hold land, when did service become appetite? If obedience made men strong, what happened when that strength frightened kings? The Impossible Brotherhood solved one problem by creating another. It gave Christendom a disciplined sword, and from the moment that sword was blessed, admired, funded, and feared, the question was no longer whether such men could exist. The question was what they might become. Chapter 8. The silence of the first years. The most useful thing about a silence is that it can be made to say almost anything. This is especially true when the silence sits at the beginning of a famous story. The early Templars did not leave behind the kind of full, satisfying record that later curiosity would like to have. We want minutes from the first meetings, lists of members, descriptions of their quarters, precise accounts of their daily duties, and some clear explanation of how a small brotherhood moved from obscurity toward recognition. Instead, we have fragments, and fragments are dangerous. Not because they are false, but because they invite completion. The first years of the Templar Brotherhood occupy that dim space where history has enough shape to be real, but not enough detail to feel settled. We can speak with some confidence about the need they answered: the protection of pilgrims in a violent and unstable Holy Land. We can speak about their association with the royal palace area on the Temple Mount, near the site Crusaders identified with Solomon's Temple. We can speak about Hugues de Payens and the emergence of a small circle of knights who would eventually become formalized as a religious order. But when we lean closer, the record does not become clearer. It becomes thinner. That thinness became one of the great engines of Templar legend. Later writers looked back at the order's early obscurity and saw not poverty, administrative fragility, or the ordinary loss of documents, but concealment. If the knights were living near the supposed Temple of Solomon, and if they later rose with astonishing speed, then surely something must have happened there. Perhaps they excavated beneath the platform. Perhaps they discovered sacred objects. Perhaps they found ancient writings, hidden treasure, lost knowledge, or some dangerous truth that gave them influence beyond their numbers. The idea is tempting because it turns absence into drama. A missing record becomes a covered track. A practical residence becomes an entrance to a buried world. A few quiet years become an initiation. The lack of evidence does not weaken the legend. Strangely, it feeds it. The less the archive says, the more space there is for the imagination to descend underground with a torch in its hand. But careful history has to resist that descent, at least at first. There is no solid evidence that the earliest Templars uncovered a secret beneath the Temple Mount. There is no secure record of a hidden excavation that transformed them from poor knights into masters of forbidden knowledge. The story survives because it feels meaningful, not because it is proven. It makes emotional sense. It explains too much too neatly. The location, the name, the later wealth, the secrecy, the sudden authority. That neatness is exactly why we should be cautious. Real history is often less symmetrical. The early silence may have a more ordinary explanation. The Brotherhood was small. Its first members were not yet the center of international attention. Documents could be lost, never written, or never considered important enough to preserve. Medieval institutions often become clearer in the record only after they acquire patrons, property, disputes, privileges, and enemies. A group guarding pilgrims might not generate much paperwork until donors, bishops, kings, and popes began to take notice. In other words, the silence may not hide a secret. It may reveal insignificance before fame. That is a less cinematic answer, but it has a sharp edge. It reminds us that institutions often become legendary only after the world decides their beginnings must have been legendary too. Once the Templars became powerful, their early poverty no longer seemed sufficient. People wanted a cause equal to the effect. A handful of knights protecting pilgrims did not feel grand enough to explain an order that later owned estates, built castles, moved money, answered to popes and unsettled kings. So the imagination searched backward for a more satisfying origin. This is one of the common habits of myth-making. Later greatness is projected into the cradle. The founder must have known. The first room must have contained a sign. The chosen place must have been chosen for a hidden reason. But at the time, the people involved may have been improvising with far less certainty. They may have been solving immediate problems with whatever resources they could gather. The Templars' silence is therefore not empty. It tells us about our own hunger for pattern. It also tells us about the power of the Temple Mount itself. Had the first knights been housed in an ordinary stable outside an ordinary fortress, their early obscurity might have attracted little attention. But place changes the meaning of a gap. Silence beneath Solomon's shadow sounds different from silence anywhere else. The same missing details that would be ignored in a rural commandery become charged with possibility when attached to the most symbolically dense ground in Jerusalem. That is why the legends of excavation are so persistent. They are not random fantasies. They grow from a real convergence, a young order, a sacred site, a name linked to Solomon, and a period of poor documentation. The legend may be unsupported, but it is not incomprehensible. It is what happens when imagination finds a locked door in a building already famous for hidden meanings. Still, there is a difference between understanding a legend and believing it. The historian's task is not to strip the story of wonder until nothing remains. It is to ask where the wonder actually belongs. In this case, the wonder may not lie in buried relics. It may lie in how quickly a practical religious experiment became surrounded by meanings larger than itself. A few men took vows and guarded roads. A king gave them quarters. A sacred name attached itself to them. Then the silence around their first years allowed later centuries to dream on their behalf. That process is fascinating enough without forcing the evidence to say more than it can. The Templars did have secrets in the ordinary institutional sense. Any disciplined order has internal customs, private meetings, rules of admission, habits of command, and matters not shared with outsiders. But secrecy is not the same as hidden ancient knowledge. A closed door can protect discipline, not necessarily treasure. A guarded ceremony can create identity, not necessarily conspiracy. The later accusations against the order would exploit this confusion ruthlessly, treating privacy as proof of corruption. But in the first years, the silence was still softer. It had not yet become a weapon. It was simply the hush around an institution not yet famous enough to be watched closely. That is perhaps the most important detail. The first Templars were not living in a future courtroom, aware that every action would be judged by kings, inquisitors, novelists, treasure hunters, and late-night documentaries. They were men inside a new and unstable world, trying to make a strange vocation work. Their obscurity was not necessarily a mask. It may have been the ordinary condition of a small beginning. And yet, because of where they lived, ordinary obscurity could never remain ordinary for long. The Temple Mount gave the silence depth. Solomon gave it a name. Later power gave it motive. Later destruction gave it pathos. By the time the order was gone, that early gap had become one of the most valuable spaces in medieval legend, a place where anything might be imagined because so little could be disproven. So the buried temple in the Templar story may not be a physical chamber at all. It may be the early record itself, partially hidden, uneven, broken, and irresistible. We lower question into it, hoping they will strike metal. Most of the time, they touch only stone. But the echo continues, and for many people, the echo is enough. Chapter 9. Troyes. The secret becomes official. A mystery changes character the moment someone writes it down. Before Troyes, the Templars could still appear as a Jerusalem experiment, a small brotherhood of armed religious men, useful to the Crusader kingdom, attached to the Temple Mount, wrapped in a name that sounded older than the order itself. They had a mission. They had patrons. They had atmosphere, which is not a small thing in medieval history, but atmosphere alone does not make an institution endure. For that, they needed recognition. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Brotherhood stepped into the formal world of Latin Christendom. This was not a scene of hidden masters revealing forbidden knowledge. It was something colder, more durable, and perhaps more important: approval, regulation, and a rule of life. The Templars were no longer just men with a sacred purpose. They were becoming a sanctioned religious order. That shift matters because it changed how the world could treat them. A group of knights guarding pilgrims might be admired, donated to, or quietly ignored. A recognized order with an approved rule could claim a different kind of authority. It could attract support across regions. It could explain itself to bishops and nobles. It could turn personal devotion into institutional loyalty. It could survive the deaths of its founders. This is where the word secret has to be handled carefully. Troyes did not reveal a secret in the sense that later legend would enjoy. No ancient treasure was displayed. No Solomonic document was placed before the council. What became official was not a hidden object, but a new category of life. That may sound less dramatic, but it was revolutionary in its own restrained way. The Templars had been living inside a contradiction. Monks who fought, knights who renounced private life, warriors who claimed obedience as a spiritual discipline. Troyes gave that contradiction a frame. A rule could tell the brothers how to live, how to submit, how to behave, how to understand their mission, and how to separate themselves from ordinary knightly culture. It did not remove the tension. It gave the tension a structure strong enough to carry it. Medieval institutions depended on such structures. Without them, charisma fades, a founder dies, a patron changes his mind, a kingdom loses territory. A promising brotherhood becomes one more memory among many. But a rule can outlive personality. It can be copied, enforced, interpreted, amended, and used to shape strangers into members of the same body. The Council of Troyes, therefore, turned the Templar idea from an improvisation into a repeatable form. This is one of the least cinematic and most consequential moments in their story. Modern legend prefers vaults and tunnels because they give power a secret source. But medieval power often grew through parchment, permission, and procedure. A rule could do what buried gold could not. It could make people trust that the same order existed in more than one place, across distance, across time, across changing leadership. Trust was the true treasure being created. Once the Templars had recognition, a donor in Europe could imagine his gift traveling safely into an approved religious framework. A noble family could give land without feeling it had merely enriched a local band of armed men. A young knight could join not simply an adventure, but a vocation with ecclesiastical weight. The order could say, in effect, "We are not an accident of the Crusader frontier. We belong to the Church's larger design." The importance of that claim is hard to overstate. The Crusader states were physically distant from much of Europe, but spiritually close. Jerusalem lived in the imagination of Christians who would never see it. Troyes helped build a bridge between that imagination and practical support. The Templars could now be presented not as a local solution to local danger, but as a universal cause. Their roads were in the Holy Land, but their appeal could reach France, England, Italy, Spain, and beyond. This was how a brotherhood became scalable. The word sounds modern, almost indecently businesslike, but the idea fits. The Templars needed a way to reproduce discipline. A knight in Jerusalem and a recruit in Europe had to be formed by the same identity. Their possessions had to be understood as belonging to one mission. Their obedience had to be directed through an internal hierarchy. Their poverty had to be more than a slogan. Their violence had to be more than enthusiasm with a religious excuse. A rule made all of that possible. It also made the order easier to admire from afar. Distance is kind to ideals. A lord in Champagne or a widow in Anjou did not have to watch the daily compromises of armed life on the frontier. They could see the Templars through the language of sacrifice, poor soldiers of Christ, living under discipline, protecting pilgrims near the holy places. Troyes strengthened that image by giving it official weight, but official approval also came with a hidden cost. The moment the Templars became legitimate in the eyes of the Church, they also became more visible. Their identity hardened. Their claims could be repeated more confidently. Their failures, when they came, would matter more. A private experiment can fail quietly. A sanctioned order fails in public, and public failure becomes scandal. Recognition is never only protection. It is exposure. At Troyes, the Brotherhood received the gift of seriousness. They could no longer be dismissed as a handful of eccentric knights living near a powerful symbol. They were now part of the religious and political imagination of Christendom. Their way of life had been judged worthy of form. The dangerous mixture, vow and weapon, humility and force, had not been rejected. It had been accepted, shaped, and sent back into the world with authority. This is the moment when the Templar story begins to widen. Jerusalem remains at the center, but Europe now enters the frame more strongly. The Order's future would depend not only on what happened along pilgrim roads, but on estates, donors, councils, privileges, recruitment, reputation, and the slow accumulation of trust. The sacred geography of the Temple Mount had given them a name. Troyes gave them a body, and bodies grow. A rule can seem dry until we remember what it does to human beings. It arranges time, it controls appetite, it defines obedience. It teaches men when to speak, how to dress, what to own, whom to obey, how to confess failure, and what kind of life their death will complete. For warriors, this was especially important. The rule was meant to turn dangerous men into disciplined instruments. Whether it always succeeded is not the point. The point is that medieval Christendom now believed the attempt was worthy. That belief transformed the Templars more deeply than any legend of discovery beneath Jerusalem. A secret object might have enriched them, a rule remade them. It allowed a small group of men to become an institution that could receive property, command loyalty, and present itself as both humble and untouchable. At Troy, the mystery did not disappear. It changed clothing. The brotherhood that had lived in the shadow of Solomon now stepped into the light of approval, and from that light came a new kind of shadow, the shadow cast by an institution that could grow faster, reach farther, and endure longer than the men who first imagined it. Chapter 10. Bernard and the Holy Warrior. The Templars had received a rule, but a rule alone could not quiet every doubt. The problem was not administrative, it was moral. A council could recognize the brotherhood, and patrons could admire their discipline. But the deeper question remained: how could a Christian life built around humility, obedience, and salvation also be built around the sword? This was not a small difficulty to be brushed aside with banners and brave language. Medieval Christians lived with a powerful awareness that violence endangered the soul, even when war was necessary, even when it was praised, even when it was fought for a cause called holy. It still carried the smell of pride, anger, and damnation. The man who killed might claim duty, but duty did not automatically cleanse the heart. The Templars needed more than approval. They needed an explanation. Bernard of Clairvaux helped provide one. He was not a Templar commander, not a battlefield founder, not a man whose importance came from riding with a lance under the sun of the Holy Land. His power was of another kind. Bernard belonged to the world of monastic reform, preaching, discipline, and spiritual authority. He understood language as a force that could shape conscience. He knew that an idea becomes dangerous or acceptable depending on the frame placed around it. And the Templar idea needed framing very badly. Without it, the order could look like a scandal. Monks abandoning peace for warfare, knights dressing violence in religious clothing, men of God taking up the habits of men of blood. With the right theological interpretation, however, the same men could appear as disciplined servants, not fighting for vanity, but for protection. Not seeking private glory, but surrendering themselves to obedience. That transformation was not cosmetic. It was the heart of the matter. Bernard helped present the Templar as a new kind of warrior, one whose danger came not from rage, but from discipline. In this vision, the knight's old temptations were to be stripped away. Fine clothing, personal display, romantic vanity, tournaments of ego, quarrels over status. All of that belonged to a corrupted martial culture. The Templar was supposed to stand apart from it. He was not to fight in order to be admired. He was to fight because he had submitted his will to a sacred mission. The distinction is subtle, but in the medieval mind, it could change everything. Violence for the self was spiritually poisonous. Violence under obedience, directed toward the defense of pilgrims and holy places, could be presented as service. The knight did not become safe because he carried a sword. He became acceptable because the sword was no longer supposed to belong to his pride. That was the theory. The reality, as always, must have been more tangled. Human motives do not vanish because an eloquent monk describes them away. A man can renounce vanity and still hunger for recognition. He can take vows and still feel anger. He can be told that his violence is disciplined and still discover, in the heat of danger, that discipline is a fragile thing. Bernard's language did not magically purify every Templar. What it did was give the order a spiritual architecture strong enough to be believed. And belief mattered. A religious order does not live by rules and buildings alone. It lives by the stories people accept about it. Donors had to believe that giving land or money to the Templars was not financing ordinary warfare. Recruits had to believe that joining the order was not a descent from knighthood into obscurity, but an ascent into a harder and cleaner vocation. Churchmen had to believe that this new brotherhood did not corrupt monastic life, but extended it into a dangerous frontier. Bernard's support helped make that belief possible. This is one of the most important turns in the Templar story, because it shows how power is often created before the money arrives. The order's later wealth can make us forget that its first great achievement was conceptual. It persuaded a Christian society to accept the figure of the armed monk. It made the holy warrior imaginable without making him ridiculous or obviously blasphemous. That was not inevitable. Plenty of religious experiments could have failed at the level of language. A strange movement might be dismissed before it matured, not because it lacked courage, but because no one could explain why it should exist. The Templars survived that danger. They were given not only a rule, but a vocabulary of holiness. Their armor could now be read as sacrifice. Their obedience could be read as purification. Their danger could be read as service. This did not remove the contradiction. It sanctified the attempt to live inside it. Bernard's role also reveals something about the wider crusading world. The defense of Jerusalem was not only fought with swords, ships, castles, and money. It was fought with interpretation. Europe had to be persuaded again and again that events in the Eastern Mediterranean mattered to the soul of Christendom. The Holy Land was far away, expensive, politically unstable, and often disappointing. Without a language of sacred duty, enthusiasm could fade. The Templars became a living argument against that fading. They embodied continuity. Even when a great crusading army was not marching, they remained. Even when ordinary pilgrims returned home, they stayed. Even when kings negotiated, quarreled, or hesitated, the order presented itself as a permanent vow placed in the path of danger. Bernard's vision gave that permanence a spiritual dignity. There is, however, a darker intelligence in this transformation. Once armed violence is described as a disciplined spiritual mission. It can inspire sacrifice, but it can also make criticism harder. To question a warrior may be ordinary politics. To question a warrior of Christ can begin to sound like weakness, impiety, or betrayal. Sacred language raises the moral stakes for everyone, including those who hesitate. That is why the Templar image was powerful and perilous at the same time. Bernard did not create a cheap slogan. He helped shape an ideal of terrifying seriousness. The knight who has renounced himself so completely that he can fight without seeking himself in the fight. Whether such a person can truly exist is a question the order of fully escaped. Perhaps a few came close. Perhaps many tried. Perhaps some used the ideal as cover for ordinary ambition. The evidence cannot open every conscience, but the ideal changed history. It allowed the Templars to appear not as a compromise between monk and knight, but as a correction of both. The monk who withdrew from danger might now seem incomplete in a world where pilgrims were dying. The knight who fought for himself seemed spiritually compromised. The Templar stood between them, claiming to be prayer made militant, knighthood made obedient, violence forced into the service of salvation. This was the language that helped carry the order beyond its fragile beginning. And yet, beneath the admiration, A question remained waiting for later centuries. If the Templars were holy because their violence was disciplined, what happened when the world stopped trusting the discipline? If their power came from obedience, what happened when no king could easily command them? If their vows made them pure, what happened when their wealth made them look like every other power on earth? Bernard helped Christendom believe in the holy warrior. He did not solve the danger of believing too much. Chapter 11. The Pope's Shield. Power does not always arrive with a sword drawn. Sometimes it arrives as a seal, a formula, a carefully written privilege, a sentence that looks dry until men begin to obey it. For the Templars, one of the most decisive changes in their history did not happen on a road outside Jerusalem or in a hidden chamber beneath the Temple Mount. It came through papal protection. In 1139, the bull Omnidatum Optimum helped place the order under the special authority of the Pope. That may sound like a legal detail, the kind of thing that belongs in a footnote rather than a legend. But in medieval Europe, legal privileges could reshape reality. They decided who could command, who could interfere, who could collect, who could judge, and who could say no. For a young order built on discipline, reputation, and sacred purpose, papal protection was not decoration, it was armor. The Templars had already gained recognition. They had already been given a way to explain the impossible brotherhood of monk and knight. But papal privilege gave them something even more useful: distance from ordinary control. They were no longer simply dependent on local bishops, local nobles, or regional politics. Their highest protection came from the center of Latin Christendom's spiritual authority. That changed the order's posture. A Templar house in Europe could now be imagined as part of something larger than the diocese around it. A commander collecting rents or receiving donations was not merely managing local property. He was serving a mission protected by Rome and tied to Jerusalem. A noble who gave land to the order was not just helping a band of armed monks. He was placing wealth into a privileged religious structure whose purpose had been lifted above ordinary quarrels. This is where the Templars began to become transnational in the deepest sense. Not modern, not borderless in the way a modern corporation might be, but unusually free to move through the patchwork world of medieval authority. Europe was not a single legal space. It was a dense landscape of lords, bishops, customs, courts, taxes, obligations, and jealous rights. To operate across it required more than courage. It required protection that could travel. The papal shield allowed the order to travel. It did not make the Templars untouchable in every practical sense. No privilege can erase politics. Local tensions still mattered. Kings still watched. Bishops still cared about authority. Neighbors still argued over land, money, and rights. But the order now possessed a higher language of defense. When challenged, it could appeal not merely to usefulness or reputation, but to papal favor. That kind of independence is easy to admire when the institution is trusted. It is easy to fear when trust begins to fade. In the early decades, the privileges helped the Templars do what supporters wanted them to do. They could gather resources efficiently. They could build houses and commanderies. They could move men, animals, equipment, and money toward the needs of the Holy Land. They could receive gifts without being swallowed by every local structure around them. Their mission demanded reach, and papal protection gave reach a legal spine. The irony is sharp. The order that had begun with poverty needed independence to protect its mission. But independence helped create the very power that later made its poverty look suspicious. This was not hypocrisy by itself. A vow of poverty for individual brothers did not mean the institution had to be weak. A poor knight still needed a horse. A fortress still needed stone. A road escort still needed supplies. A military order without resources would be a prayer with no legs. The papacy understood, or at least accepted, that the defense of the holy places required organized wealth. But organized wealth has a way of changing how people look at holiness. At first, papal privilege could make the Templars seem purer, because it lifted them above local greed and faction. Later, the same privilege could make them seem evasive, arrogant, or secretive. A house that answered beyond the region could be respected as universal or resented as foreign. A brother who obeyed the order before the local lord could look disciplined or disloyal. The meaning depended on whether the viewer trusted the institution behind the mantle. That is one of the central tensions of Templar history. The mechanisms that made them effective also made them vulnerable to suspicion. Papal protection strengthened their religious identity, but it also separated them from ordinary society. It told the world that these men were not quite like other monks, not quite like other knights, not quite like other landholders. They belonged to a wider body with its own chain of command, its own customs, and its own protected purpose. That made them useful to Christendom, but also difficult to read. And people fear what they cannot easily read. The order's independence also deepened the mystery around its internal life. A disciplined religious body naturally guards some of its proceedings. It has admissions, corrections, punishments, accounts, decisions, and obligations not meant for public performance. Under papal protection, that privacy could be defended more strongly. While the order was admired, privacy looked like discipline. When enemies later came, privacy would be reinterpreted as concealment. The facts had not necessarily changed. The atmosphere around them had. This is why omnidatum optimum matters so much. It did not simply grant favors. It helped create the conditions for the Templars' later greatness and later danger. The bull stands near the point where the order's identity begins to harden into something larger than its founders could have personally managed. The Brotherhood of Jerusalem became a religious military network with permission to act across borders and to gather the resources required by a permanent war. A permanent war needs a permanent institution, and permanent institutions become heavy. They accumulate property. They keep records. They develop hierarchies. They disappoint some people and reward others. They attract idealists, opportunists, administrators, and critics. They depend on trust, but they also generate resentment by surviving longer than the emotions that first made them popular. The Templars were still wrapped in the language of sacred service, but beneath the mantle, the machine was beginning to form. Papal privilege did not corrupt them automatically. It enabled them. It gave them the legal shelter to grow into the role Europe had asked them to play. The tragedy, if we can call it that, is that Europe would later be startled by the size of the thing it had helped build. The poor knights had needed a shield. Rome gave them one, and behind that shield, the order learned how to become more than a brotherhood, a power that could own land in one kingdom, recruit in another, send wealth across the sea, answer to a spiritual authority above local rulers, and carry the name of Solomon wherever its houses rose. The secret of the Templars was not hidden beneath the earth. Not here. It was written into privilege, protected by law, and made stronger every time someone treated their independence as proof of holiness. Only much later would others look at the same independence and call it something else. Chapter 12. The Machine Beneath the Mantle. The Templars are often remembered by their symbols: the white mantle, the red cross, the severe faces of armed monks riding under a sacred banner. But symbols do not feed horses. They do not repair saddles, ship grain, build castles, hire laborers, store weapons, collect rents, preserve records, negotiate with donors, or move silver across a continent. Behind the image of the holy warrior stood something less romantic and far more important: a system. This was the real engine of Templar power. Not a single treasure found beneath Jerusalem. Not a hidden doctrine whispered from Solomon's age into medieval ears. The order's strength grew from organization. Patient, practical, disciplined organization. The kind that turns scattered gifts into estates. Estates into income. Income into supply, and supply into military endurance. The mantle was what people saw. The machine was what made the mantle matter. Across Europe, the Templars received land, houses, mills, vineyards, pasture, rights, rents, and privileges from donors who believed they were supporting the defense of the Holy Land. Some gifts were grand, others were modest. A field here, a revenue there, a share in a mill, a house near a road, a flock, a coin, a piece of woodland, a legal right that would look dull in a chronicle but valuable in an account book. This is how institutional power often grows, not only through spectacular grants, but through accumulation. A single donation might not change history. 1,000 donations, managed well, can build an empire of usefulness. The Templars' commanderies became the local organs of this wider body. They were not all castles, and they were not all dramatic. Many were working estates, agricultural, administrative, financial, and logistical centers. They collected produce, managed animals, oversaw tenants, stored goods, and turned rural income into support for a military mission far away. To a villager nearby, a Templar house may have seemed less like a mysterious fortress and more like a disciplined landlord with a chapel, accounts, brothers, servants, and a very serious reputation. That seriousness mattered. Trust was one of the order's greatest assets. The Templars were religious men under vows. They were internationally connected. They were protected by privilege. They had houses along major routes and ties to powerful patrons. Over time, these qualities allowed them to handle money and valuables in ways that made them useful beyond the battlefield. A pilgrim, noble, or crusader might need funds available far from home. Moving wealth physically across dangerous roads and seas was risky. The Templars, with their network of houses and their reputation for discipline, could help bridge distance. Their financial role should not be exaggerated into modern banking in a careless way, but it should not be dismissed either. They became trusted handlers of wealth because they possessed something rare, an institution that could be recognized in many places. A man might not trust a stranger. He might trust the order. That is a different kind of power from military force. Quieter, but deeper. Military force can take a gate. Administrative trust can hold a system together for generations. The Templars learned to operate in that second world, as well as the first. In the Holy Land, their castles and fortified positions formed part of the defensive landscape of the Crusader states. Stone here was not merely stone. It was policy made visible. A castle controlled roads, watched territory, stored supplies, housed men, and announced that Latin Christendom intended to remain. But castles were hungry things. They consumed labor, money, food, maintenance, and reinforcements. A fortress could look permanent from the outside while constantly depending on shipments, repairs, and decisions made far away. That is why the European estates mattered so much. The Templar presence in the East was sustained by the West, fields in France, revenues in England, gifts in Iberia, and houses in Italy could all become part of the long chain that supported men and fortifications in the eastern Mediterranean. This was the hidden geography of the order, not a map of secret tunnels, but a map of supply. And supply is where romance goes to be tested. It is one thing to imagine a knight charging under a cross. It is another to imagine the grain that fed his horse, the blacksmith who repaired his equipment, the ship that carried materials, the clerk who tracked obligations, the brother who enforced discipline, and the donor whose piety paid for it all. The Templars survived because they made the second world serve the first. That required hierarchy. A brotherhood built only on enthusiasm would have collapsed. The order needed officials, rules, chains of command, regional structures, and mechanisms of accountability. It needed men who could fight, but also men who could administer. The warrior may dominate the legend, but the administrator deserves a place in the story. Without him, the holy warrior becomes a stranded ideal with no bread, no horse, and no replacement sword. There is a dry humor in that, but also a truth. Medieval holiness still needed paperwork. The order's discipline allowed it to convert scattered devotion into usable power. A noble might donate for the salvation of his soul, for family memory, for prestige, for genuine belief in the crusading cause, or for several motives at once. The Templars could receive that gift, preserve its legal meaning, attach it to a larger mission, and make it productive. They turned private anxiety about salvation into public infrastructure. This is a less glamorous secret than treasure, but far more historically convincing. It also explains why the order became both admired and resented. People tend to admire efficient sacred institutions while they believe in the sacred purpose. Once belief weakens, the efficiency begins to look predatory. The same commandery that once represented devotion can start to look like a wealthy landholder. The same financial trust can become a rumor of hidden greed. The same discipline can be recast as secrecy. The Templars did not have to change completely for the world around them to change its interpretation. Their machine was built to serve a mission: protect pilgrims, defend the Holy Land, support crusading warfare, maintain a permanent religious military presence. As long as that mission felt urgent and noble, the machinery beneath it seemed justified. But machinery has a dangerous habit. It keeps running. It gathers weight. It develops interests of its own. It becomes visible as power, and power invites questions. Why does an order of poverty hold so much land? Why do men who renounced private wealth manage such enormous resources? Why does a brotherhood founded to guard pilgrims now handle royal treasure, negotiate with kings, and stand behind walls across Europe? The answers were not necessarily sinister, but they were complicated, and complicated answers rarely defeat suspicion once suspicion becomes politically useful. This is the moment when the Templar story begins to darken in a more believable way. Not because the order's success proves corruption, but because success changed the meaning of everything around it. A small group of poor knights could be loved easily. A vast, privileged, wealthy international order required trust on a much larger scale. When that trust held, the Templars looked like guardians. When it cracked, they looked like a state within states. The machine beneath the mantle was their masterpiece. It was also their vulnerability. Because the real secret of Templar power was never that they escaped history. It was that they mastered some of history's most practical forces: land, law, reputation, discipline, logistics, and money. They built a system strong enough to carry a holy war across distance. Then, in time, that same system became too visible to remain innocent in the eyes of men who needed someone to blame. Chapter 13. When guardians became too powerful. The problem with becoming indispensable is that people eventually begin to resent their dependence on you. For much of their rise, the Templars had been useful in ways that were easy to praise. They protected pilgrims. They defended castles. They gave Europe a disciplined image of sacred warfare. They moved resources toward the Holy Land with a seriousness few institutions could match. Their houses, lands, privileges, and financial habits were not accidental decorations around the Order's mission. They were the machinery that made the mission possible. But usefulness does not remain innocent forever. As the decades passed, the Templars became harder to see simply as poor soldiers of Christ. They were still bound by vows. Their individual brothers were still meant to live under discipline. Their official purpose still pointed toward the defense of the holy places. Yet the order had grown into something large, wealthy, and unusually independent. It owned land. It managed estates. It held castles. It answered to a chain of authority that crossed borders. It enjoyed privileges that could frustrate local bishops, nobles, and rulers. To supporters, this was the strength of the order. To critics, it became the beginning of the accusation. The Templars had been created to solve a crisis of vulnerability. Pilgrims were exposed. Jerusalem needed defenders. The Crusader states were fragile. But when the larger Crusader project began to suffer losses, the meaning of the order shifted. A military institution tied so closely to the Holy Land could not avoid being judged by the fate of that land. Every defeat raised uncomfortable questions. Every lost fortress made the old confidence harder to sustain. If God favored the cause, why did the cause keep bleeding territory? If the orders were guardians, why could they not preserve what had been entrusted to them? Those questions were not always fair. The Templars were powerful, but they were not miracle workers. They could not single-handedly solve the demographic, military, political, and logistical weaknesses of the Crusader states. They operated within a world of rival rulers, shifting alliances, limited manpower, exhausted treasuries, and enemies who were not passive figures waiting to be defeated. But public imagination rarely distributes blame with care. It looks for visible symbols. The Templars were very visible. Their secrecy made matters worse, though secrecy here should be understood carefully. A religious military order naturally had internal rules, initiations, discipline, councils, and financial matters not thrown open to everyone outside. Privacy was part of institutional life, but the more powerful the order became, the more its privacy began to feel like concealment. The same closed door that once suggested seriousness could now suggest arrogance. The same obedience that once looked holy could now look threatening. This is one of the recurring transformations in history. Trust turns discipline into virtue, and suspicion turns discipline into conspiracy. The Templars also suffered from the burden of their own symbolism. Their name had given them immense authority. Poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. The phrase still sounded charged with sacred purpose. But sacred names create severe expectations. An ordinary landholder can be greedy without shaking the imagination of an age. A holy order that appears greedy produces a deeper kind of anger. It feels like betrayal. Whether that anger was justified in any given case is harder to prove. Large institutions attract abuses, tensions, failures, and compromises. It would be naive to imagine the Templars were untouched by human weakness, but it would be equally careless to treat later suspicion as proof of hidden guilt. Much of the hostility around them grew from the contradiction they had carried since the beginning. Poverty joined to property, humility joined to privilege, religious obedience joined to military power. For a time, that contradiction had made them inspiring. Later, it made them vulnerable. Their autonomy placed them in an especially dangerous position. Because they were protected by papal privilege, they did not fit neatly into the ambitions of kings. Because they held property in multiple realms, they were both local and foreign. Because they handled wealth, they became connected to royal finance and elite obligation. Because they were religious, attacking them required more than ordinary political pressure. A ruler could not simply treat them as another noble family to be subdued. Their holiness had to be challenged before their power could be broken. That would matter greatly in the years ahead. But before the fall, there was the slow erosion of confidence. The loss of Crusader territory weakened the order's original justification in the eyes of many observers. If the permanent war in the East could no longer be won, or even convincingly sustained, then what was the vast Western machine for? The estates remained. The commanderies remained. The privileges remained. The money continued to move. Yet the sacred frontier that had explained all of it seemed increasingly fragile, distant, and compromised. This did not make the Templars useless. It made them easier to question. A successful institution can survive criticism when its purpose feels urgent. Once the purpose becomes uncertain, every privilege looks excessive. Every exemption becomes offensive. Every sign of wealth looks like proof that the institution has forgotten its vows. The Templars were not the only military order, and they were not the only wealthy religious body in medieval Europe. But their particular combination of sanctity, secrecy, finance, and armed force made them an unusually attractive target for resentment. Their legend also began to work against them. The association with Solomon, the Temple Mount, and the early silence of their origins had once deepened their aura. But aura is unstable. What makes people fascinated can also make them afraid. The more the order seemed to stand apart from ordinary explanation, the easier it became to imagine that ordinary morality did not govern it. A brotherhood that had borrowed mystery from sacred geography could not entirely control what later generations did with that mystery. This is the uncomfortable truth. Myths do not always protect the people they glorify. Sometimes they prepare the ground for accusation. By the late medieval imagination, the Templars could be seen in two opposing ways. To one eye, they were veterans of a sacred cause, guardians whose wealth had been built for service. To another, they were a privileged and secretive power whose original mission had faded while its riches remained. Both views drew from real features of the order. That is why the tension was so potent. The suspicion did not have to be invented from nothing. It only had to reinterpret what already existed. The poor knights had become landholders. The guardians had become creditors. The monks with swords had become political actors. None of these changes, by itself, proves corruption. Together, they created an atmosphere in which corruption could be believed, and belief was becoming dangerous. The Templars had survived because Christendom trusted the meaning of their contradictions. It trusted that their poverty could hold wealth without becoming greed. It trusted that their secrecy guarded discipline rather than crime. It trusted that their independence served Jerusalem rather than themselves. It trusted that their violence remained obedient to a sacred purpose. Once that trust weakened, the entire structure became exposed. The order had not lost its body yet. Its houses still stood. Its brothers still served. Its name still carried weight. But something had shifted in the air around it. The mantle that once seemed radiant with sacrifice had begun, in certain royal and political circles, to look like a covering. And when powerful men begin to believe that a sacred covering hides a useful target, danger is no longer theoretical. Chapter 14. The King Who Needed a Scapegoat. The fall of the Templars did not begin with treasure being uncovered. It began with paperwork, pressure, fear, and a king who understood the usefulness of accusation. Philip IV of France was not the first man to resent the order's power, but he was the one with the will and machinery to move against it on a devastating scale. By the early 14th century, the Templars were no longer an easily romantic brotherhood of poor knights guarding roads to Jerusalem. They were wealthy, privileged, international, and difficult for any single king to control. Their original mission had been weakened by the loss of Crusader territory. Their independence, once admired, now made them look dangerously separate. To Philip, or to the royal government around him, they were more than suspicious. They were useful. That distinction matters. A truly weak enemy can be ignored. A truly beloved institution can be difficult to touch. But the Templars occupied a dangerous middle ground, powerful enough to be worth attacking, isolated enough to be vulnerable, mysterious enough that accusations could cling to them. They had property. They had a closed internal life. They had rituals outsiders did not fully understand. They had a reputation that mixed holiness with secrecy. And they had the misfortune of existing within reach of a monarchy that wanted obedience, money, and control. On October 13th, 1307, the blow fell. Across France, Templars were arrested in a coordinated operation. The date has become famous partly because it feels theatrical now, as if history itself had chosen a cursed number. But the real terror of the moment was not superstition. It was organization. Doors opened, men were seized. A powerful order that had stood for nearly 2 centuries found itself suddenly treated not as a shield of Christendom, but as a nest of criminals. The charges were severe, intimate, and spiritually poisonous. The Templars were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the cross, engaging in obscene initiation practices, worshipping idols, and committing other acts designed to make them appear not merely corrupt, but anti-Christian at the root. These were not ordinary complaints about greed or arrogance. They attacked the sacred identity of the order itself. If believed, they did not simply tarnish the Templars, they inverted them. That was the genius and cruelty of the case. To destroy a holy order, it was not enough to say it had too much land. Wealth could be criticized, but wealth alone did not justify annihilation. Independence could be resented, but privilege had been granted by popes. Military failure could be discussed, but the Templars were not solely responsible for the collapse of Crusader fortunes. The accusations had to strike deeper. They had to make the white mantle look like a disguise. Once the order could be imagined as secretly blasphemous, every old ambiguity changed meaning. Their private ceremonies no longer looked like religious discipline. They looked like evidence of hidden corruption. Their obedience no longer looked like holiness. It looked like training in silence. Their wealth no longer looked like resources for a sacred mission. It looked like the treasure of a dangerous conspiracy. The very features that had once made the Templars impressive became material for the prosecution. Confessions followed. But this is where the story must be handled with great care. Many confessions were extracted under pressure, and some under torture. A confession produced in fear does not carry the same weight as a free admission. Medieval legal systems often treated confession as a powerful form of proof, but modern readers should not mistake that legal power for moral certainty. A terrified prisoner may say what he believes will end pain, avoid worse suffering, or satisfy interrogators who already know the answer they want. This does not mean every document from the trials can be dismissed without thought. It means the circumstances of production matter. The Templar trials are not best understood as a clean unveiling of hidden guilt. They are better approached as a political and legal drama in which accusation, coercion, royal ambition, religious anxiety, and institutional vulnerability converged. The order's secrecy made it hard to defend itself in public imagination. Its wealth made it tempting to attack. Its decline in purpose after losses in the East made it easier to ask why it still possessed so much. And its sacred image meant that any scandal, once believed, would be explosive. Philip's move was ruthless because it did not merely arrest men. It attacked the story that had protected them. For generations, the Templars had survived by being understood as disciplined servants of Christ. Philip's case offered a different story, that the discipline was a mask, the service a fraud, the brotherhood a hidden corruption wrapped in piety. Whether the king believed all of this in his private conscience is impossible to know with certainty. What can be seen more clearly is that the accusations served royal power very well. They turned a difficult institution into a vulnerable one. They placed the order on the defensive before the court of Christian opinion. They made the question of Templar wealth inseparable from the question of Templar sin, and they forced the papacy into a crisis. The Pope could not easily ignore charges of such gravity, yet the circumstances were deeply entangled with French royal pressure. The Templars were supposed to stand under papal protection. That had once been their shield. Now the shield was tested by a king determined to break through it. The result was not a simple battle between innocence and guilt, but a struggle over authority. Who had the right to judge a religious military order, and who benefited if that order was destroyed? The human dimension should not disappear beneath the legal machinery. The men arrested in 1307 were not symbols to themselves. They were brothers, knights, sergeants, priests, administrators, servants of an institution that had given shape to their lives. Some may have been old. Some may have joined long after the great age of Crusader confidence had faded. Many had probably spent their days managing property, observing discipline, and living inside routines far less dramatic than the accusations hurled against them. Then, suddenly, the world told them that their vows meant nothing, their order was monstrous, and their memories were evidence. That kind of collapse is almost impossible to imagine fully. A man can endure poverty if he believes it has meaning. He can endure obedience if the institution commanding him remains honorable. He can endure danger if the banner above him is trusted. But when the banner itself is declared foul, the whole architecture of identity begins to fall inward. This is why the Templar downfall still feels unsettling. Not because it proves the legends true, but because it shows how quickly a sacred reputation can be reversed when power finds the right language. The order had spent generations building trust. Philip's attack taught Europe to reinterpret trust as deception. And once that reversal began, the Templars had very little room left to breathe. They could deny, but denial sounded like secrecy. They could confess, but confession had been shaped by fear. They could appeal to their service, but the Holy Land had largely been lost. They could point to papal privilege, but royal force had already taken hold of their bodies. The king who needed a scapegoat had found an order large enough to blame, rich enough to seize, strange enough to fear, and holy enough for its fall to feel like revelation. That was the tragedy of 1307. Not that a hidden truth finally came into the light, but that light itself was controlled by men who knew where to aim it. Chapter 15. The Order Without a Body. An institution can be killed more easily than a legend. That is one of the strange lessons of the Templars. By the early 14th century, the order had already been wounded by arrest, interrogation, scandal, and fear. Its brothers had been scattered through prisons and proceedings. Its name, once protected by the force of sacred purpose, had been dragged into a language of accusation. The white mantle had not vanished, but it no longer meant what it once had. Then came suppression. In 1312, the Order of the Temple was formally dissolved. The decision did not feel like the simple conclusion of a criminal case, because the case itself had never been simple. It had been shaped by royal pressure, papal anxiety, coerced confession, political need, and the larger unease surrounding an institution that had become too wealthy, too independent, and too difficult to explain after the old Crusader dream had broken. The Templars had once been given a body by recognition and rule. Now that body was taken away. This is what suppression means at the deepest level. Not merely that men lost property, or that buildings changed hands, or that seals ceased to authorize documents. It means that a shared life was declared no longer legitimate. The routines, vows, ranks, possessions, memories, and internal loyalties that had made the order feel real were stripped of public meaning. A brother could still remember being a Templar, but the world no longer allowed the order to stand around him. That is a peculiar kind of death. A castle can be captured. A treasury can be seized. A man can be imprisoned. But an order is also made of recognition. It exists because enough people agree that its vows, offices, and authority are valid. Once that recognition is withdrawn, the institution becomes a ghost while its members are still breathing. 2 years later, in 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was executed. His death gave the legend what suppression alone could not provide, a final human figure. Institutions are difficult to mourn in the abstract. They are too large, too legal, too tangled in property and power. But a man at the end of his life, standing beneath the weight of a destroyed brotherhood, gives memory a face. De Molay became that face. The documented order ended in disgrace and fire. The imagined order was just beginning its long afterlife. This is where the story changes texture. Before suppression, the Templars had been a living institution surrounded by rumor. After suppression, they became an absence surrounded by possibility. And absence is generous to myth. It does not correct people. It does not issue statements. It does not open account books and say, "No, the treasure was spent on horses, fortifications, ships, debts, repairs, and the dull necessities of war." The dead order could no longer disappoint the imagination. So the legends grew. Treasure stories were almost inevitable. The Templars had been wealthy, and their wealth had been part of the case against them in the public mind, whether fairly or not. When a wealthy order falls, people naturally ask where everything went. Some property passed into other hands. Some records survive unevenly. Some valuables may have been moved, hidden, seized, or lost in ordinary ways. But ordinary explanations rarely satisfy a public trained by scandal to suspect concealment. The question, "Where did the money go?" slowly becomes, "Where is the treasure?" And once treasure enters the story, the Temple of Solomon returns. The old association with Jerusalem gave later fantasy a perfect foundation. If the Templars had lived near the sacred platform, if their earliest years were poorly documented, if they later became powerful, and if their final downfall left people wondering what had been hidden or removed, then the imagination could connect all the points into a single underground line. Treasure beneath the temple. Secret knowledge carried west. Relics concealed before the arrests. Archives spirited away before royal officers arrived. Some of these tales are later inventions. Some are exaggerations. Some may preserve faint memories of real movements of goods or documents. But the evidence does not allow the grander claims to stand as fact. The legend may be rich. The archive is much thinner. Survival myths followed the same pattern. If the institution had been destroyed, perhaps the order had not truly died. Perhaps some brothers escaped. Perhaps they carried the secret into another country, another order, another brotherhood, another century. This kind of story comforts the imagination because it refuses finality. It turns defeat into concealment, humiliation into strategy, execution into a mask. The Templars did not lose. They withdrew. They did not end. They transformed. History gives us no need to accept these claims as proven, but it is easy to understand why they flourished. The destruction of the order created a wound in the story of Christian knighthood. For almost 2 centuries, the Templars had been presented as guardians of holy purpose. Then, with shocking speed, they were accused, arrested, dissolved, and condemned in memory. Such a reversal begs for explanation. Some accepted the accusations. Others suspected royal greed. Still others preferred the darker pleasure of hidden truth. A clean ending was impossible because the fall itself had been so politically contaminated. Then came the curse. Stories surrounding Jacques de Molay's final words would later grow into the idea that he summoned judgment upon those responsible for the order's destruction. As with so much in this Templar afterlife, the legend is more secure as legend than as courtroom fact. But its emotional power is obvious. A condemned Grand Master, a king, a pope, a destroyed order, and the sense that earthly justice had failed. These ingredients almost demand a final prophetic line. A curse gives moral shape to a messy ending. It says that even if the courts were compromised, heaven was not. It says that power may burn a man, but it cannot fully command the meaning of his death. Whether or not the famous curse happened as later retellings imagined, it survived because it answered a need. It made the downfall feel judged. That is why the Templars became stronger in legend after they disappeared in law. While the order lived, it had limits. It owned particular estates, fought particular battles, made particular decisions, and failed in particular ways. Once it was gone, it became available to everyone: monarchists, revolutionaries, occultists, romantics, treasure hunters, nationalists, novelists, and conspiracy theorists could each create their own Templars. The order without a body could wear any costume. The real men would hardly recognize most of them. They had begun as armed protectors in a dangerous crusader world. They had grown through rule, patronage, papal privilege, land, logistics, and trust. They had fallen through political pressure, accusation, and the collapse of the confidence that once held their contradictions together. But the legend did not need the full reality. It needed fragments. Solomon, secrecy, wealth, arrest, fire, and an ending that felt unfinished. The body of the order was destroyed. The shadow learned to travel. Chapter 16. The real origin of the Templars. So what, finally, were the Templars? Not the fantasy version, polished by centuries of rumor. Not the immortal brotherhood carrying Solomon's private wisdom through hidden tunnels and sealed vaults. Not the perfect villains of a royal prosecution, secretly rotten from the beginning. The documented origin is stranger than either of those stories, because it belongs so completely to the medieval world that made them possible. They were a religious military order born from pilgrimage, crusade, danger, patronage, sacred geography, and institutional power. That answer may sound less dazzling than an ancient conspiracy, but it explains more. The Templars began with a road. Pilgrims were vulnerable. The Holy Land after the First Crusade was not a peaceful Christian kingdom resting securely beneath heaven's approval. It was unstable, violent, and thinly held. Sacred sites could inspire devotion, but devotion still had to pass through hills, ambush points, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. The first purpose of the Brotherhood was practical: armed protection in a landscape where holiness did not cancel danger. Then came the place. King Baldwin's gift of quarters near the Temple Mount did not prove that the knights inherited Solomon's secrets. It gave them something different: proximity to one of the most symbolically charged sites in the world. Crusaders associated that ground with the Temple of Solomon, and the Brotherhood's name absorbed the force of that association. From then on, they were not merely protectors. They were poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A practical mission had been given an ancient shadow. Then came recognition. At Troyes, the strange experiment of monks with swords became official. Bernard of Clairvaux gave the idea a language powerful enough to quiet many doubts, or at least redirect them. Papal privileges later gave the order independence, protection, and reach. Donations gave it land. Discipline gave it trust. Trust gave it money. Money gave it logistics. Logistics gave it endurance. This was the real secret beneath the mantle. Not a hidden relic, but a system. The Templars became powerful because they solved problems that medieval Christendom desperately needed solved. They connected Europe to Jerusalem through property, vows, reputation, and administration. They transformed private gifts into public military capacity. They created a network that could feed horses, maintain castles, move funds, receive recruits, and keep a distant war alive in the imagination of people who would never see the Holy Land. And then, the same qualities that built them helped destroy them. Their poverty became hard to reconcile with their wealth. Their discipline began to look like secrecy. Their independence angered rulers. Their sacred reputation made scandal devastating. After the Crusader position in the East weakened, the order's purpose became easier to question. When Philip IV of France moved against them in 1307, he did not need to prove an ancient conspiracy. He needed accusations strong enough to turn holiness into suspicion. The tragedy is that the Templars were destroyed in history and then enlarged in myth. Their suppression in 1312 and the execution of Jacques de Molay in 1314 ended the order as a legal body. But the absence they left behind was too dramatic to remain empty. Treasure stories entered. Survival stories entered. Curses entered. Solomon returned, no longer as a medieval association of place and name, but as the imagined source of forbidden knowledge. The legend survived because the real story contained just enough mystery to invite it. There was a sacred mountain. There was an early silence. There was sudden growth. There was wealth. There was secrecy. There was a spectacular fall. Those pieces do not prove the myth, but they explain why the myth found such fertile ground. The real origin of the Templars is not less meaningful because it is not ancient in the way legend claims. It is meaningful because it shows how history actually creates shadows. A vulnerable road becomes a mission. A royal gift becomes a sacred identity. A name becomes a destiny. A disciplined order becomes a power. A political destruction becomes an immortal mystery. So Solomon's shadow still clings to them, not because we can prove they carried his secret, but because they stood where history, faith, conquest, and imagination overlapped. And some places do not need to hide a secret. They become one.